"Not worth $1 million," they whispered as the dark brown stallion stood motionless in the center of the gleaming auction ring, his once proud frame now bearing the weight of countless defeats. The elite indoor auction hall buzzed with the quiet confidence of wealth, crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across polished leather boots and tailored jackets worth more than most people earned in a year. This was where champions were bought and sold, where bloodlines commanded fortunes and pedigrees determined destinies. But tonight, standing on the sawdust-covered floor beneath the harsh spotlight, was something that didn't belong. The stallion's dark coat was dull and scarred, his ribs visible beneath skin that had known too much hunger and too little care. His mane hung in tangled knots, and his eyes held the hollow emptiness of an animal whose spirit had been systematically broken. The murmur of expensive conversations filled the air as buyers sipped champagne and studied their catalogs, dismissing him with barely a glance. The auctioneer, a distinguished man in a crisp navy suit, struggled to maintain his professional composure as he gestured toward the horse. His voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of someone accustomed to selling million-dollar animals, but even he couldn't hide the uncertainty flickering across his face. This wasn't the kind of horse that belonged in a venue like this among the elite bloodstock that typically graced these halls. Polished boots shifted against marble floors as the crowd grew restless. Men in $1,000 suits leaned back in their chairs, some checking their phones, others whispering among themselves about the real prizes yet to come. The dismissal was palpable, rolling through the audience like a cold fog. To them, this broken creature represented everything they had risen above, everything they had worked to distance themselves from. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he had learned long ago that movement only brought pain, that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. His breathing was steady, but shallow, his gaze fixed on something beyond the crowd, beyond the judgment, perhaps remembering a time when he had been something more than this shadow of himself. But in the back of the hall, where the lighting grew dim and the shadows gathered thick, something stirred. A figure shifted in the darkness, and for the first time since the horse had entered the ring, someone was truly watching, not with the calculating eyes of a buyer searching for profit, but with the recognition of someone who understood that sometimes the most valuable things come disguised as the most worthless. The auctioneer's voice grew more desperate as the silence stretched on, his professional mask beginning to slip as he faced the possibility that this auction might end without a single bid. The stallion's ears twitched slightly, the only sign that he was aware of the judgment surrounding him, and in that small movement, something profound was about to unfold. Sometimes the most powerful voices speak without saying a word, and in that electric moment when silence filled the auction hall, a figure emerged from the shadows like an answer to an unspoken prayer. The man who stepped forward bore no resemblance to the polished elite surrounding him, his suit worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs, speaking of countless years and countless struggles weathered with quiet dignity. His weathered hands told stories that no amount of money could write, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of honest work, yet steady with the confidence of someone who had never forgotten his own worth. The crowd's attention shifted like iron filings drawn to a magnet, their laughter dying in their throats as they tried to place this unexpected presence among their carefully curated world. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned that true strength lies not in commanding attention, but in earning it through actions that speak louder than words ever could. The expensive suits and designer boots around him suddenly seemed costume-like in comparison to his authentic presence, as if he had stripped away all pretense to reveal something genuinely human beneath. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence, his professional composure wavering as he sensed the shift in the room's energy. This wasn't the usual choreographed dance of wealth competing with wealth, but something altogether different, something that threatened to upset the careful balance of power that governed these elite gatherings. When the man raised his hand, the gesture was simple yet profound, carrying the weight of conviction that comes from seeing beyond surface appearances to recognize true value where others see only failure. His bid rang out clear and unwavering, not shouted with the aggressive confidence of those accustomed to winning, but spoken with the quiet certainty of someone placing his faith in something greater than profit. The number he called sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd, whispers spreading like wildfire as the wealthy elite struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an unexpected bid, it was a declaration that challenged everything they believed about worth and value, about who belonged in their rarefied world and who didn't. The stallion's ears pricked forward for the first time that evening, his dark eyes finding the man who had spoken on his behalf. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended the barriers of species and circumstance, as if two souls who had been searching for each other across time and distance had finally found their way home. The man's gaze never wavered from the horse, seeing past the scars and neglect to the magnificent spirit that still burned beneath the surface. His presence alone seemed to kindle something in the stallion's eyes, a flicker of hope that had long been dormant but never truly extinguished, waiting for someone who possessed the vision to see what others had dismissed as worthless. Hidden beneath layers of deliberate deception lay a truth that would shatter the carefully constructed illusions of everyone present. For this broken stallion carried within his veins the blood of legends that men had killed to possess. The bidding escalated with ruthless intensity as more hands shot up across the auction hall, wealthy buyers suddenly awakening to the possibility that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple transaction. The mysterious man's knowledge became apparent in the way he responded to each escalating bid, not with the frantic desperation of someone stretching beyond their means, but with the calm assurance of someone who understood exactly what he was fighting for. His worn suit seemed to grow more dignified with each number he called, as if the truth of his identity was slowly revealing itself through his unwavering determination. Whispers began circulating through the crowd like autumn leaves caught in a sudden wind. Fragments of half-remembered stories about a champion who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions and carefully crafted lies. The stallion's scars took on new meaning as observers began to recognize them not as random marks of neglect, but as evidence of systematic attempts to erase his distinctive markings, to transform a priceless thoroughbred into an anonymous broken creature. The auctioneer's face had grown pale as recognition dawned, his professional composure cracking as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding beneath his gavel. This wasn't just any forgotten horse standing in his ring, but a living piece of racing history that powerful people had worked very hard to make disappear forever. Each bid from the mysterious man carried the weight of justice, seeking to restore what had been stolen, while the competing offers from the crowd reflected their growing desperation to control a truth that threatened to expose uncomfortable secrets. The stallion seemed to sense the shift in energy surrounding him, his posture straightening slightly, as if awakening from a long forced slumber. The man's eyes never left the horse as he continued to outbid the increasingly frantic competition, seeing past the deliberately inflicted damage to the magnificent bloodline that no amount of cruelty could truly erase. His bids came with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment, who had searched through countless auctions and shadowy dealings to find what others had tried so hard to destroy. The wealthy elite found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being outmaneuvered by someone they had dismissed, their confident smirks replaced by expressions of growing concern as they realized they were bidding against someone who possessed a knowledge they lacked. The horse's true identity hung in the air like an unspoken accusation, challenging everything they thought they knew about power and worth. As the numbers climbed higher, the stallion's breathing seemed to deepen, as if each bid was slowly returning pieces of his stolen dignity. The man's unwavering commitment spoke of a bond that transcended money, of someone fighting not just to own, but to liberate a spirit that had endured too much for too long. Truth has a way of demanding payment in full. And when the horse's identity finally burst into the light like dawn breaking over a darkened landscape, the price became clear to everyone who had wagered their judgment against destiny. The auction hall transformed from a place of casual dismissal into a battlefield where fortunes hung in the balance, where reputations crumbled like ancient walls unable to withstand the force of revelation. The mysterious man's final bid cut through the chaos with the precision of a blade finding its mark. A number so astronomical that it seemed to suspend time itself within the marble walls of the auction house. The wealthy elite who had laughed at his worn appearance now sat frozen in their leather chairs, their faces pale masks of shock as they realized they had been playing a game whose rules they never truly understood. The stallion's true worth wasn't measured in the millions being called out across the hall, but in the bloodline that coursed through his veins like liquid history, connecting him to champions whose names were etched in racing legend. Each scar on his body told a story of deliberate destruction, of powerful people who had tried to erase what could never truly be destroyed. The auctioneer's gavel trembled in his hand as he called for final bids, his voice barely audible above the thunderous silence that had consumed the room. The competing bidders found themselves outmatched, not just financially, but morally, facing the uncomfortable truth that they had been complicit in dismissing something priceless simply because it arrived, wrapped in suffering. The man who had emerged from the shadows stood unwavering as the final seconds ticked away, his weathered face reflecting decades of patience that had led to this singular moment of justice. His bid represented more than money changing hands. It was redemption speaking in the only language this world understood, forcing recognition through the brutal arithmetic of auction house warfare. When the hammer finally fell, the sound echoed through the hall like a verdict being rendered, sealing not just a transaction, but a transformation that would ripple far beyond these walls. The stallion lifted his head slightly, as if sensing that the long nightmare of his exile was finally drawing to a close. The wealthy spectators who had gathered to witness the buying and selling of Bloodstock found themselves confronting something far more profound than commerce. They had witnessed the resurrection of a legend, the reclamation of stolen dignity, and the triumph of someone who had never stopped believing in the value of what others had discarded. The mysterious man stepped forward with quiet dignity, his worn suit now seeming like armor that had carried him through years of searching and waiting for this moment. As he approached the stallion, the horse's eyes met his with recognition that transcended words, an acknowledgement between two souls who had found their way back to each other despite all attempts to keep them apart. The auction hall would never be the same, forever changed by the night when true worth revealed itself and demanded the respect it had always deserved. Recognition arrives like sunrise, after the longest night, gradual at first, then blazing with undeniable clarity as the pieces of a shattered puzzle finally find their way back together. The hammer's echo still reverberated through the auction hall when whispers began spreading like ripples across still water, carrying fragments of a name that had once commanded reverence throughout the racing world. Thomas Ashford stood motionless beside his newly claimed stallion, and in that moment of stillness, the years seemed to peel away like layers of old paint, revealing the masterpiece beneath. The crowd's collective memories stirred, awakening to the truth of who they had been watching all along. Not some mysterious stranger with worn clothing and weathered hands, but a legend in his own right who had vanished from the spotlight as completely as the horse he had just reclaimed. The man who had once trained 3 Kentucky Derby winners, whose gentle methods had revolutionized an industry built on dominance and force, had been searching for this particular stallion for half a decade. The wealthy spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they realized they had dismissed not just any bidder, but someone whose expertise they had once paid fortunes to access. The stallion's response to Ashford's presence told the deeper story that money could never buy. This wasn't the reunion of owner and property, but the recognition between two souls who had been torn apart by forces beyond their control, who had survived their separate exiles and found their way back to each other through paths marked by suffering and perseverance. Ashford's exile from the racing world had been as deliberate as the horse's disappearance, orchestrated by those who feared what his success represented, that gentleness could triumph over brutality, that respect could achieve what intimidation never could. Both trainer and stallion had been written off by an industry that preferred its legends to remain safely in the past, rather than challenging its present practices. The auction hall buzzed with the electricity of revelation, as observers began connecting fragments of stories they had heard but never questioned. The mysterious accidents, the sudden retirements, the careful erasure of records, all of it had been designed to separate two beings whose partnership had threatened to prove that there was a better way. Now, standing together again beneath the harsh lights of the auction ring, they represented something more powerful than either could achieve alone. The stallion's posture began to change, his head lifting slightly as recognition flickered in his dark eyes, remembering what it felt like to be valued for more than his bloodline or his scars. Ashford placed his hand against the horse's neck with the reverence of someone touching a piece of his own soul that had been lost for too long. The gesture spoke of countless hours spent together, of trust built through patience rather than force, of a bond that neither time nor deliberate cruelty had been able to destroy. The wealthy elite who had gathered to witness commerce found themselves confronting something far more profound: the power of love, to endure, to heal, and ultimately to triumph over those who mistake cruelty for strength. Freedom tastes different when it has been earned through suffering. And as Thomas Ashford led his reclaimed stallion through the heavy wooden doors of the auction hall, both man and horse felt the weight of artificial judgment lifting from their shoulders like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. The cool night air wrapped around them with the tenderness of an old friend's embrace, carrying with it the promise of roads that led away from the sterile world of commerce and back towards something real. The stallion's first steps on the gravel parking lot were tentative, as if his hooves were relearning what it meant to move without the expectation of pain. But with each stride, something awakened in his muscles, a memory of power that had been dormant but never truly extinguished. His ears began to swivel forward rather than flatten back, drinking in sounds that spoke of possibility rather than threat. Ashford walked beside him with the patience of someone who understood that healing happened in increments, that trust rebuilt itself one gentle moment at a time. The trainer's weathered hands moved with the careful reverence of someone tending something sacred, every gesture speaking a language of respect that the horse's body began to remember despite the years of cruelty that had tried to erase it. The parking lot stretched before them like an ocean of possibility, each step carrying them further from the world that had reduced them both to commodity and closer to the sanctuary, where their bond could flourish without the interference of those who mistook dominance for strength. The stallion's breathing deepened as the auction hall's artificial lights faded behind them, replaced by the honest darkness of night sky scattered with stars. In that darkness, something profound began to shift in the horse's carriage. His head lifted slightly, not with the defiant desperation of an animal at bay, but with the quiet dignity of a being remembering his own worth. The scars that marked his coat seemed to fade in importance beside the growing light in his eyes, that unmistakable spark that no amount of abuse could permanently extinguish. Ashford's voice began to flow like water over stones, soft words of promise that dissolved into the night air and settled into the horse's consciousness like seeds finding fertile ground. The trainer spoke of meadows where running was joy rather than obligation, of days measured by the sun's path rather than the cruel arithmetic of profit and loss. The old truck and trailer waited like a ship, ready to carry them across the ocean between their painful past and their hopeful future. As they approached, the stallion's step quickened slightly, not with fear but with anticipation, as if some deep instinct recognized that this journey would lead not to another auction block, but to home. The night wrapped around them both with the promise of dawn, carrying them away from the judgment of those who had never understood that true value couldn't be measured in dollars or bloodlines, but in the unbreakable bond between souls who had found their way back to each other across time and suffering. Healing refuses to follow schedules or surrender to impatience. And in the quiet sanctuary of Ashford's remote ranch, time moved with the deliberate rhythm of seasons rather than the frantic pulse of the auction world they had left behind. The stallion stood in his spacious paddock like a living sculpture of accumulated pain, each scar on his dark coat telling chapters of a story that demanded reverence rather than pity. The morning sun filtered through ancient oak trees, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the healing ground, where trust would be rebuilt one breath at a time. Ashford approached with the measured grace of someone who understood that broken spirits required different medicine than broken bones, that the deepest wounds were invisible to even the most skilled veterinarian's eye. The horse's initial response to kindness was heartbreaking in its confusion, his body flinching away from gentle touches, as if tenderness itself had become a foreign language. Years of cruelty had taught him that human hands brought pain, that survival meant staying beyond reach of those who claimed to care. But Ashford possessed the patience of someone who had walked this path before, who knew that healing happened in whispers rather than shouts. Days blended into weeks, as the slow alchemy of rehabilitation worked its quiet magic. The trainer would simply exist in the horse's presence, asking for nothing, demanding nothing, offering only the steady constancy of someone who had nowhere else to be. His weathered hands moved with the reverence of a master craftsman, restoring a damaged masterpiece, understanding that each small gesture carried the weight of promises, both spoken and unspoken. The stallion's physical recovery was the easier part of their journey together. Proper nutrition filled out his gaunt frame, careful grooming restored the luster to his coat, and gentle exercise began rebuilding the magnificent muscle that had once carried him to victory. But his spirit remained guarded, protected behind walls built from betrayal and maintained by the hard-learned wisdom that trust was a luxury he could not afford. The breakthrough came not in a moment of drama, but in a breath so subtle, it might have been missed by anyone not watching. With the devotion of someone who had waited years for such a gift, the horse turned toward Ashford rather than away, his dark eyes meeting the trainer's gaze without the desperate weariness that had marked every previous encounter. In that simple gesture lived the seed of everything that would follow. Trust began to grow, like morning light, creeping across a darkened landscape, gradual and almost imperceptible, until suddenly the world was transformed. The stallion's ears began to prick forward when Ashford approached, his step lightening from the heavy trudge of survival into something approaching the fluid grace that was his birthright. Each small victory represented a triumph over the forces that had tried to break them both, proof that love, wielded with patience, could accomplish what force never could. The horse was remembering not just how to trust, but how to hope, how to imagine a future that extended beyond the next moment of potential pain. Glory returns not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of water, finding its natural course, and as spring painted the ranch in shades of renewal, the stallion's transformation became undeniable to anyone blessed with eyes to see. The broken creature who had stood motionless in that auction hall had dissolved like winter frost, replaced by something magnificent that moved with the fluid grace of liquid power contained within living sculpture. His morning runs across the meadow spoke a language older than words, each stride a declaration that the spirit within had not merely survived but had grown stronger through its trials. The scars that marked his coat had become part of his story rather than its conclusion, silver lines that caught the sunlight like badges of honor, earned through endurance rather than shame. Ashford watched from the fence rail as his old friend rediscovered what it meant to run for joy rather than survival, to stretch those powerful muscles, not in flight from pain, but in celebration of freedom. The horse's coat had regained its lustrous depth, his eyes blazed with intelligence that years of cruelty had tried to extinguish, and his presence commanded the respect that had always been his birthright. But in the quiet moments between trainer and stallion, Ashford began to recognize another transformation taking place, one that surprised him with its gentle insistence. The act of healing his old friend had unknowingly begun mending wounds within himself that he had carried for so long they had become part of his identity. The forced exile from the racing world had left scars on his soul that matched those on the horse's hide, marks of betrayal and loss that had convinced him his best days were behind him. Now, watching the stallion move with renewed confidence, Ashford felt something stirring within his own chest that he had thought buried forever. The passion that had once driven him to revolutionize training methods, the joy he had found in the partnership between human and horse, the certainty that gentleness could achieve what force never could. All of it was awakening like flowers blooming after a harsh winter. The horse's trust had become a mirror in which Ashford could see his own worth reflected, unmarred by the judgment of those who had sought to destroy them both. Every breakthrough in the stallion's recovery had been matched by a corresponding healing in the trainer's spirit, proving that salvation was rarely a solitary journey, but something that happened between souls who recognized each other across the darkness. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pasture. As the stallion approached the fence where Ashford stood, his step confident and unhurried, the horse's muzzle brushed against the trainer's weathered palm with the tender familiarity of old friendship restored, and in that simple touch lived the promise that their greatest victories still lay ahead. They had both returned from the wasteland of broken dreams, not as the same beings who had been torn apart years ago, but as something stronger, tempered by suffering into an alloy that could not be broken by those who mistook cruelty for strength. Legends are born not in moments of triumph, but in the quiet persistence of spirits that refuse to surrender. And as the stallion thundered across the endless meadow with his dark coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the golden afternoon light, his story transcended the boundaries of a single life to become something eternal. The grass bent beneath his hooves like the earth itself was bowing in recognition of the majesty that had been restored to its rightful place in the world. Ashford stood at the weathered fence rail, his weathered hands resting against the sun-warmed wood, as he watched his old friend embody everything that true freedom meant. The horse moved with the liquid grace of power unleashed from the constraints of fear, each stride a declaration that dignity could survive any attempt to destroy it. His mane flowed like dark silk in the wind he created through his own magnificent momentum, and his eyes blazed with the fire that had never truly been extinguished. The transformation was complete, yet it felt less like an ending than a beginning. The broken creature from that auction hall had been revealed as an illusion, a temporary disguise worn by greatness during its darkest hour. Now running beneath the infinite sky, the stallion had reclaimed not just his physical strength, but his spiritual inheritance, the unshakable knowledge that worth could never be determined by those who lack the vision to recognize it. Their story began to ripple outward like stones cast into still water, carrying with it lessons that extended far beyond the racing world that had tried to destroy them both. People spoke in hushed tones about the trainer who had never stopped believing and the horse who had survived everything thrown at him, their bond becoming a beacon for anyone who had ever been dismissed, discarded, or deemed worthless by those who confused price with value. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, transforming the meadow into a cathedral where miracles were not only possible, but inevitable for those with patience enough to wait and faith enough to endure. The stallion's joy was infectious, spreading across the landscape like wildfire, proving that freedom was not something that could be granted by others, but something that lived eternally within spirits strong enough to remember their own worth. Ashford felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that some things in this world still mattered more than money, that love wielded with patience could accomplish what force never could, and that true legends were written not in record books but in the hearts of those who witnessed greatness disguised as brokenness and chose to see beyond the surface. The horse's thundering hooves created a rhythm that spoke of coming home, of finding the place where spirit and flesh could dance together in perfect harmony, free from the judgment of those who had never understood that some treasures reveal themselves only to eyes trained to see beyond appearances. Thank you for watching this story of redemption and unbreakable spirit. If you enjoyed witnessing this journey of transformation, please like this video and subscribe for more incredible tales of hope, healing, and the extraordinary bonds that can emerge from the darkest circumstances. I'll see you in the next video.